April 2025, Donald Trump unleashes a tariff tsunami.
Liberation Day. April 2nd, 2025 will forever be remembered.
Starting at 10% on the world, 25% on America's neighbors, and 54% on China.
Cheaters have stolen our jobs, foreign cheaters have ransacked our factories, and foreign scavengers have torn apart our once beautiful America.
Global markets implode, trillions vanish in a day. Is this economic genius or the spark of a new Great Depression? Smoot-Hawley's shadow looms, a trade war that sank the world into chaos. Now Trump's betting big, reshoring jobs, staring down China, prepping for war. But at what cost? Recession? Conflict? Or American dominance reborn?
If you've ever watched this channel and enjoyed the content, or if you're enjoying this episode, could I ask for a small favor? Please hit the subscribe button. Your subscription helps this channel more than I can explain right now, and also makes you an integral part of our success. I promise to return the favor by making the show increasingly better. We're on this journey together, and I'm willing to make that promise to you if you hit the subscribe button.
Wait a second.
Do we have a deal?
The world recoils from Trump's April 2nd tariff edict.
I will sign a historic executive order instituting reciprocal tariffs on countries throughout the world.
10% baseline on all imports, 25% on North America, and now 54% on China, compounding a 34% reciprocal increment atop the 20% from his first term. Markets imploded April 3rd, and I'm drawn to 1930. Trade fell 66%. The Great Depression intensified. Are we on the verge of a parallel catastrophe?
The Smoot-Hawley Tariff Act of 1930 elevated duties by something like 20 to 60 percentage points across 20,000 imported goods. In my mind, that was legislative overreach that was born of congressional myopia rather than executive vision. The consequences were dire. Global trade contracted by 66% between 1929 and 1934, which exacerbated the nascent depression into a decades-long malaise. U.S. unemployment, for example, peaked at under 25% in 1933. Now, contrast this with what Trump is doing, his framework. It's a 10% universal tariff, a 25% levy on North American partners, and now 54% rate on China, building upon a 20% baseline from his first presidency between 2018 and 2020, and augmented by a 34% retaliatory adjustment, which he just announced. This is not a haphazard revenue grab akin to Smoot-Hawley, which I think I read somewhere something like 335 million yield in 1930s dollars. Who knows what that is today? But it's a deliberate geopolitical plan targeting some 450 billion in Chinese imports, electronics, textiles, machinery, you name it, to redress trade asymmetries and assert economic sovereignty. The intent seems to diverge, in my mind, fundamentally. Where Smoot-Hawley sought protectionism, Trump appears to pursue reciprocity and, well, strategic leverage.
Yet strategic intent does not preclude unintended ruin. Smoot-Hawley's economic toll was magnified by its political fallout. Over 1,000 economists petitioned Hoover to veto it, forcing retaliatory tariffs from Canada, France, and Spain that fractured global cooperation. Today, Canada threatens 25% duties on $155 billion of U.S. exports. China counters 34% retaliatory tariff on all goods imported from the U.S. Could Trump's 54% on China, impacting a $439 billion trade nexus, precipitate a depression reminiscent of the 1930s or beyond?
Smoot-Hawley operated within a fragile post-World War I economy. Global debt was, I think, 180% of GDP, and the stock market crash was still reverberating. It was fresh in everybody's mind. Today's context, while strained, global debt's at an extraordinary $318 trillion, still retains greater structural resilience in my mind. It's bolstered by diversified supply chains and monetary policy tools that simply weren't present in 1929. Trump's 54% tariff on China, it encompasses $450 billion in goods, and it builds on his first-term duties that reduced U.S. imports from China by an extraordinary 18%. So between 2018 and 2020, while catalyzing a 12% uptick in domestic steel production. So there is a precedence for these tariffs having a positive impact on reshoring American manufacturing. Retaliation was inevitable. China's 34% retaliatory tariffs, which were announced today on all goods imported from the U.S., Canada's response, which imperils something like $155 billion in bilateral trade, but the scale and scope differ. Smoot-Hawley's indiscriminate 60% average rate provoked a 40% decline in U.S. exports. Trump's graduated approach, with China's exports projected to contract, I think something like 30 to 50%, aims to reorient rather than collapse global trade as it did in the early 1930s. The specter of depression certainly looms if coordination fails.
Markets, however, signal distress. April 3rd sell-off erased trillions. April 4th looks like it's going to be a repeat. Goldman Sachs downgraded GDP projections. Recession murmurs intensify. Smoot-Hawley's contracted U.S. GDP by amplifying an already faltering system. Trump's 54% on China, hitting smartphones, laptops, toys, may elevate costs 15 to 25%. Are we underestimating the enduring economic toll?
The April 2nd tariff proclamation triggered an immediate market turbulence. The S&P 500 shed, I think, 3.5%. The NASDAQ was 4.3%, could have been more, reflecting acute sensitivity in technology, in automotive sectors, in retail, in clothing. It really covered a very broad range of industry sectors that are reliant on Chinese inputs and Mexican assembly, for example. The 15 to 25% cost increase aligns with a projected $329 to $500 per household burden from the Chinese tariffs alone. And that will, of course, escalate to something like $2,100 to $3,000 annually when aggregated with the broader levies. Smoot-Hawley, by contrast, precipitated a whopping 15% GDP contraction from 1929 to 1933. Imagine that. Trump's calculus diverges somewhat here. The 54% rate on Chinese goods projected to reduce China's exports volume by, I think, 15 to 20% of its total, pairs with incentives for domestic reinvestment, which we are already beginning to see, for example, with the dialing up of auto manufacturing in Indiana. First-term tariffs spurred a 6% rise in manufacturing employment in targeted sectors. This iteration seeks to amplify that effect. Markets oscillate. The S&P nears a 12% correction. But the long-term trajectory, it really hinges on execution. Successfully reorienting supply chains could ultimately mitigate inflationary pressures and bolster GDP for the U.S., whereas Smoot-Hawley offered no such end.
Is this mitigation or a mirage? Smoot-Hawley estranged allies. Trump's tariffs strained Canada, Mexico, China. The EU mulls 20% duties. America's global stature wavers as China pivots to Southeast Asia and Africa. Stocks gyrate. Can this endure?
Smoot-Hawley also alienated partners by design, reducing U.S. exports by, I think it was like 65 to 67% to Canada alone. Trump's graduated tariffs, which are 10% base, 25% on neighbors, and of course this 54% on China, they certainly elicit friction, but preserve leverage. The U.S. constitutes 24% of China's export market. That's almost an entire quarter. A dependency I don't think Beijing can swiftly unwind. So retaliation. Yeah, retaliation. China's 50% on coal, 10% on oil, and now 34% on all U.S. goods certainly inflicts some pain. Yet the $439 billion U.S.-China trade nexus is going to endure. In terms of stock volatility, it reflects an incipient fear in the markets. The S&P 500's 12% retreat from its peaks in February signals risk aversion. But potential stabilization emerges if reshoring gains traction, as evidenced by the 14% increase in the U.S. factory orders post-2018 tariffs. So Trump has a track record, really, for some success on this. Smoot-Hawley eroded stature through retreat, whereas Trump's framework asserts it through recalibration, not isolation, but a reassertion of primacy.
Let's pivot. This transcends economics. Trump's 54% on China, framed around fentanyl and deficits, hints at military posturing. It seems like a shift from economic coercion to strategic confrontation. Smoot-Hawley indirectly stoked tensions that erupted into World War II. Could these tariffs ignite conflict with China or Iran, redefining America's preeminence?
Here we traverse, really, the nexus of economics and geopolitics, a realm where wealth and economic might underwrite power. Trump's 54% tariffs on China extends his first-term policies, $300 billion in duties. Remember the Huawei sanctions? That curtailed China's technological ascent by 12% in key sectors. This escalation, which targets something like $450 billion in imports, projects, I think, a $200 to $250 billion export loss for China, something in that neighborhood, which constrains, importantly, their fiscal capacity for military expansion. And I don't think we can overlook that. There are naval fleets in the South China Sea, missile arrays along Taiwan's periphery. Economic strength really is the sinew. Smoot-Hawley depleted U.S. reserves, rendering the U.S. ill-prepared for the 1939 exigencies, whereas Trump's tariffs aim to fortify ours while weakening adversaries. Iran, too, watches. Oil markets, already tense, face secondary shocks. This is strategic positioning. This is not mere trade policy. Conflict potential with China over maritime dominance, with Iran over nuclear ambitions, it certainly is rising. Yet economic preeminence may deter escalation, preserving Pax Americana through strength.
Smoot-Hawley's trade war bred mistrust that fueled global strife. If Trump's 54% falters, think recession or broad retaliation, does America's preeminence diminish instead?
Yeah, overreach. I think overreach is a possibility, but by no means a foregone conclusion. Smoot-Hawley's failure lay in its lack of strategic coherence. Retaliation halved U.S. trade, leaving the U.S. extremely vulnerable. Trump's 54% invites reprisal, to be sure, we're already seeing that, but operates from a position of relative dominance. U.S. GDP, for example, is $28 trillion, and that dwarfs China's $18 trillion. Recession risk definitely exists. Success hinges on execution. A 10 to 50% reshoring of manufacturing, though, for example, could offset those losses, and I think that's the target of the Trump administration. Smoot-Hawley diminished us through passivity. Trump's gambit, on the other hand, seeks to elevate us through agency. Preeminence erodes only if resolve falters.
So will this be a triumph or a tragedy? Smoot-Hawley's specter lingers.
Triumph and tragedy are both possibilities, discerned only in retrospect. Trump's 54% on China is an economic theorem tested, in this case, in real time. Smoot-Hawley was a lesson, in my mind, in inertia. This is an experiment in audacity. Markets may be trembling, yet the prospect of a revitalized industrial base in the U.S. and chastened rivals beckons. America's course? It's not yet fixed.
He has a poor track record on fasting. He was once accused of using vulgar language, but he said the accusation was bullshit. He loves the smell of gasoline and burning oil around his motorcycles and never stops drinking Coke Zero. He hasn't learned how to walk away from a fight. He's been to hell and back more than once, bringing a few public companies along for the ride. Other clergy scoff at him. The SEC and Big Pharma try to, quote, silence him for good. But their efforts haven't had the intended effect. That's Father Emmanuel.
Growing up in Tirana, where the call to a dawn echoed from the spiraling minarets, was a powerful experience for her. Albanians were forced to convert to Islam under Ottoman rule. In 1967, under the Marxist-Leninist regime, Albania became the world's first atheist state and destroyed churches to eradicate Christianity, in a land where St. Paul once preached the gospel. Her grandfather fought as a guerrilla fighter, and her father commanded a tank brigade. When communism collapsed, there was an insurrection against the state, leading to anarchy. Albanian women are known for their resilience. It is said they are born from the barrel of a gun. As a teenager, her father was flown out of the country without notice on a military helicopter to save his life. From then on, she started sleeping with an AK-47 next to her bed. That's Presbytera Theodora.